looks like there's not too many people coming in and out anymore. So thank you for bearing up with the traffic at the beginning. And thank you all very much for coming to this event, which has been called Getting to the Truth, Using Open Source Data to Defend Human Rights. And our thanks to Chris Bryant at the end of the table for allowing us to use this, facilitating the use of this beautiful room, and to the Foreign Policy Center and the Human Rights Center at Essex University for organizing the event. My name is Anne Koch, and I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing the event today. I come from the world of journalism, where the whole debate about open data is alive and well, very, very important. Both the use of open data, but also some of the challenges that we'll be talking about tonight also pertain to open data in journalism. And I was at the BBC for about 20 years. I'm now the program director at something called the Global Investigative Journalism Network, which is actually the largest network of investigative journalists in the world. And we have 182 non-profit members in about 77 countries. It's a hard time for investigative journalism in many places, I can tell you. But one of the really interesting things about the work that we're doing is the fact that partly because of so much data that's available now, is many people are coming to us who aren't journalists. Many NGOs all over the world, and also individual citizen investigators, we call them, citizen investigators who are trying to find out about wrongdoing even at a local level, and they're trying to use some of the tips and tools and guides to investigating, and they can find some of them in our organization on our website. So they're coming, and it takes me to another point I wanted to make about, because there's so much stuff out there and people have access to it, there's a lot of people playing in this space, so to speak. There's a lot of crossover, and the lines are getting very blurred, which raises lots of challenges. I mean, one of the best examples of that is Bellingcat, who I'm sure you all know, who have done some absolutely extraordinary work. But of course, as I say, this raises lots of questions. And it's very, very important, of course, to human rights, which is what we're going to be focusing on in the next hour and a half or so. And how open source data can be used to defend human rights. There's great possibilities in this area, but there's also lots of issues and challenges, which also will be discussed tonight. And we have an absolutely terrific panel assembled here. And I'm going to ask each of them to speak for no more than about 10 minutes. I may ask a couple of follow-up questions, but we'll then open it for discussion and questions from the floor. And I would like to introduce now the panelists in order that they will speak. So first of all, Sam Dubberly from Amnesty International. Sam is the acting head of something called the Evidence Lab, which is in the Crisis Response Program at Amnesty International. And he will tell you all about that, I'm sure. He also heads what is called the Digital Verification Core Program. And that is a fascinating partnership between 6 global universities that contribute directly to Amnesty International's open source research. And of those 6 universities, 2 are represented here, as you'll hear in a moment on this panel. So that's Sam will start after I've introduced everyone else and talk particularly, I think, about the cases, some of the cases Amnesty's had to deal with, also some of the really difficult issues that have arisen and continue to arise. Then Dara Murray will speak, Dr. Dara Murray, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Essex School of Law and Human Rights Center. And he, again, returning to this project with the 6 universities, this initiative, is the director there of the digital verification unit that works as one of the 6 at the Human Rights Center. And his research focuses on issues relating to conflict and counterterrorism, as regulated by the law of armed conflict and international human rights law. So there's a lot more one can say about each of these people. They have spectacular CVs, but I'm going to limit it to that. Dara's going to talk about the digital verification unit and also really focus on some of the challenges. For example, the challenge of how perception, an individual's perception, can affect the use of open source investigation. Then Alexa Koning is going to speak. She deserves a special welcome, I have to say, because Alexa just got off a plane overnight from California, which is pretty far. And so thank you for coming all the way here to join us. And Alexa is the executive director of the University of California, Berkeley's Human Rights Center and lectures there in the School of Law. You're a lawyer, of course. And co-founded, again, another of the university-related projects that I mentioned earlier called the Investigations Lab. And these labs, which you'll hear a bit more about, they train students and professionals who feed directly in using investigative techniques into some of the work, for example, that Amnesty is doing. And Alexa is also going to talk a little bit about misinformation and disinformation, and importantly, her work in the area of international criminal law, which is very, very interesting. We're also absolutely delighted that we're joined by Chris Bryant. I don't think he needs an introduction in this room. Labour MP since 2001 for Rwanda and has had a range of roles in foreign policy and other areas, including media, and the list is very, very long. And we're very interested to hear...
All you mean is I haven't kept a job for more than 3 weeks.
But the reflections that Chris has to offer on, also with policy implications, I think, which there are many for some of the issues being raised today, will be very interesting. Just to add that at 7 p.m., I believe, the bell will ring and Chris will have to leave to go and vote, as I've been told. So we'll get you in before that. I think without further ado, we should start. Sam.
I know we have a deadline, it's true.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Adam and Poppy from the Foreign Policy Centre, and to Anne for being very kindly hosting this session and moderating this session. So we're here to talk today about open source information for the use of human rights. And often when I'm in a panel in a session when people talk about open source information or open source, I hear people often saying, oh, it's all about, freely available computer software. So I thought it might be useful just to kind of get a little bit of terminology around that before we start. So certainly for Amnesty International and lots of other organizations have their own view of what this means, but for Amnesty International, open source information means information that's freely available, basically on the internet, either freely available or at a very low cost. Often we use satellite imagery that we do have to pay for, but the cost in and of itself is not prohibitively expensive. So for Amnesty, that can mean we integrate open source information in a whole variety of ways. Indeed, we started really using open source information by the use of satellite imagery. So satellite imagery really was the first place that we looked at using open source information. And started integrating open source information. But the problem with just using the satellite imagery was we were looking at satellite imagery, and really the first time we did this in great detail was in 2015 when we were told there were mass graves in Burundi. And a satellite analyst found satellite imagery of the area where we were told there were mass graves, and what could we see? Well, we could see some earth that had been moved. But that in and of itself was not indication that it was a mass grave, right? There's a whole host of reasons why that earth could have been moved. And one of the greatest fears I always have when we're doing this kind of work, and whenever we publish something, is that 2 days later someone's going to turn around and tell us you're wrong, and it's actually this. So this is when we started realizing that we had to start integrating other forms of open source information as well, including photographs and videos posted on social media. I joined Amnesty in 2016 to set up this program called the Digital Verification Corps, which I think we'll come back to later on, but with Alexa and Dara. working with the students at their 2 universities, and we have 4 other universities now in the program around the world. And we were actually starting to look at how to integrate photographs and videos into the work of Amnesty, because we realized with the Burundi example that just having a satellite image wasn't enough, and we needed actually other forms of evidence. So moving forward through that period, Amnesty started to integrate open source information, which can also include large data sets, for instance, other information about businesses that's available online, anything like that. We started integrating open source information probably in around 70% of our work now. It's very rare that, certainly in terms of conflict, in terms of crisis, a report from Amnesty goes out, or a press release from Amnesty goes out, in which we haven't at least in some way tried to integrate open source information, or more likely than not, actually open source information is integrated into that. That can be for a whole host of reasons as well. Often we can't get onto the ground, right? Increasingly for either administrative reasons, we don't get a visa. So for monitoring the elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo 12 months ago, we couldn't get a visa, we were denied a visa, so we had to monitor the elections via information on Twitter, Facebook, messages sent through closed messaging apps that find its way onto social media platforms. Or it's because of safety, and the prime example of that is the conflicts in Syria or in northern Yemen, where it's just too difficult to go there. It's just too dangerous to go there. We put out a report earlier last year on drone strikes in Somalia, where yes, we sent people to Somalia, but they sat in a hotel in Mogadishu and waited for people to come to them because it was just too dangerous to go into the territory in Somalia we were looking at. So increasingly, because we can't get to places, we have to rely on open source information. But even when we can get to places, we increasingly rely on open source information as well. I can think of examples of the global protests that have been happening since June, where we send people on the ground in Hong Kong, yet you can't be everywhere. And people are filming content left, right, and center at these protests. One of our great successes last year in terms of advocacy, thanks to open source information, was that we were able to put out a report in 2 weeks, which I don't know if anybody here has actually worked with or worked for Amnesty. That's like breakneck speed for an Amnesty report, 2 weeks. I'm also from the world of journalism, so it's taken some adjustment to get there. And this report, because it incorporated open source information, because it was allowing people to tell their stories within our report, was actually printed out and stuck to the walls of police stations. So he's actually really seeing how actually having open source information integrated into a report could actually have that kind of impact. So spending time and effort actually sourcing information from the social web, going through the time-consuming steps of verifying the information, working out where it was filmed, when it was filmed, working out that if it wasn't from a different event in the same location, or from a different location with a similar event, spending that time actually going through this information becomes really valuable, both for Amnesty's speed, and I think it's a really good point that you made, Anne, about how these two worlds are starting to collide. And in a very noisy world, for Amnesty to be an organization that takes part in the conversation, increasingly we have to be fast. We have to be saying things that are relevant to news organizations, saying things that are relevant to our membership, and saying things that are relevant and can put pressure on governments to actually change things or act in some way. So the open source information also allows us to do that, actually join the conversation. So Hong Kong was a prime example of that, where news organizations, because we were using the open source information, were turning to us. But also the people on the ground in Hong Kong who were being affected by these protests were actually turning to us as a voice that could actually represent them towards the governing organizations of Hong Kong, towards the wider world. And we were actually part of that conversation. Another recent example of that also is the protests in Iran since December last year, and Iraq since October last year, where we've been monitoring those protests on an ongoing basis using open source information. Again, Iran, we were unable to gain access. Iraq, it's been too dangerous to gain access to these protests. So while our researchers are doing their interviews via other means, kind of WhatsApp, closed messaging apps, we're monitoring the open source information. And this allowed us also to pull out different things, different elements of the stories that were otherwise not being seen. And in Iraq, we were able to identify the fact that the security forces were firing smoke canisters, military-grade smoke canisters, directly at protesters, which were killing the protesters in the most gruesome and horrific ways. A story that otherwise wouldn't have been, or otherwise wasn't being told. That's not to say it's still not important to get our boots dirty. That, you know, this is not going to replace traditional research. This is never going to replace traditional research. Videos, photos posted online, they make up an essential part of human rights investigation, but still going into the field, speaking to people, getting their stories when it's possible, remains a core kind of fundamental part of human rights work. This is never going to change that. But what we think of now is that these two things go hand in hand, right? They have to go hand in hand. The risk of us getting it wrong if we only rely on open source investigation is too high. And Amnesty as an organization, the capital is not very high, except in our reputation. We do have a strong reputation around the world, and getting it wrong would be a major, major harm to that reputation. But at the same time, when we're on the ground, we have to be looking for these other stories, such as we saw in Iraq, such as we've seen in Iran, such as we saw in the protests in Chile, such as we saw in Myanmar in 2017, when the Rohingya started coming into Bangladesh, and we were taking the videos from people's phones and checking them to show crimes against humanity being committed by the Myanmar regime. So those two things have to go hand in hand, and that remains very, very important. I'll just finish by reflecting on a couple of the challenges. The number one challenge for me as a researcher is that this work is phenomenally traumatic. We talk about human rights researchers who go into the field, and we talk about journalists who go into the field. And there's people like Fergal Keane recently, who came out and said he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, the BBC reporter, from being in the field. But we also have to remember that there are people who are looking at videos and photos and looking at satellite imagery in faraway places from where events are happening, who are also being affected by the trauma of this. I also see a lot of the future challenges coming to really bite us. Recently, and I think this is something Alexa may touch on as well, we've seen a lot of content disappear. This is from pressure from European governments mostly about radicalizing videos that are appearing online, videos that could radicalize. And the pressure on the social media networks has been to build algorithms that take down these videos in mass, very, very fast, without intervention by humans, or when there is human intervention, it's very, very, they have a very short period of time in which to make that intervention and decide whether to keep a video online or not. This, of course, nobody wants videos of extremism, of the potential to radicalize online, of course not. But one of the big challenges that we're seeing is that people's stories are being taken away. People who are taking great risks to tell their stories of human rights abuses, their content is being removed from the internet before we as Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or Berkeley Human Rights Center have the chance to find this information and analyze it and work out actually what it's saying. And then the other future challenge I would see, and I'll stop there, is the challenge of synthetic media, or deep fakes as it's being called, which is algorithms which is creating very real videos that make people think something else has happened. Now, if you Google deep fakes, you'll see all sorts of horrific pornography, or you might see Nicolas Cage appear in Superman or something like that. And that's all very, the Nicolas Cage side at least is very funny. But the risk to human rights reporting is very grave for that, I think. I think we'll see minor changes in things. The change in a military uniform, or the change in a voice, in an accent. Is that Arabic accent from Aleppo? Is it from somewhere else? So that's a big risk that we have to take very great care about. We have to be very aware of as we move forward in this kind of work. But it remains an essential and will remain an essential part of human rights investigations moving forward.
Thank you. I just have one question I think people would be really interested to know, and a number of people here could answer, but since you're first, why not start? Which is, how does it actually work with the students? So are you effectively running a kind of alert desk where you have a case and you then mobilize the students? Can you just talk a little bit about how you use, if you like, the student crowd to do work for you, to find out what you're looking for?
So one of the biggest challenges we've had at Amnesty is our team is 3 people. If we just think of the global protests since June last year, I think there must be about 20 countries where there've been protests, and people, when there are protests, they go out and with their phones and their cameras and they film and they post it to YouTube or Twitter or whichever platform they like, which is wonderful, but the amount of content that produces is overwhelming, especially if you're a team of 3 people like us. So Amnesty itself is a volunteer-led movement, right? It's a movement that was founded upon the idea of people giving up their time for human rights, writing letters, if you like, sitting around the dining table in the 1970s, 1980s, writing letters. Now, writing a letter today is a right click, right? Click, click, written letter. I feel great. Haven't I defended human rights today? So we were faced with 2 challenges. How do you engage volunteers for Amnesty International in the 2010s, 2020s, in a meaningful way, not just a right click? And how do we confront this wave of content that approaches us every time a global crisis happens? And that's where the DVC was born, the Digital Verification Corps. We felt that the students who we train up, we've had about 250 students through our 6 universities in the last 2.5 years. We train them up and they contribute to Amnesty's work. We say, hey guys, there's a protest in Colombia. Can you help us find videos, verify these videos from Colombia? Hey guys, there's an airstrike in Yemen. Can you help us there? And so on and so forth. So this is how it works on a kind of global base. We kind of task them with a story, with an event. Either we go with the content to them and say, hey, we've been sent this content. Can you check it's authentic or not? Or we say, this has happened. Can you help us find the content and work out if it's authentic or not? It's a kind of a rolling process. It's kind of, I think Alexa and Dara would add 2 more. It kind of now lives with the academic calendar, which is good but challenging for us as well. You know, it's not very great when a human rights abuse happens in the summer, and we want students to help us, but we get through that. But we also feel that it's a program which is giving back to the community, because we've now had graduates through the DVC go on and work for the New York Times, Witness, the global NGO Witness, and also we've managed to cherry pick some to work for Amnesty as well.
Great, thank you. Sarah.
Great, well, thanks a million for having me. I was going to apologise for my accent, but I won't, I guess, apologise for it. But if you have trouble understanding me, let me know, and I'll try and slow down. It's a national characteristic. What I want to talk a little bit about today is almost the flip of what Sam has been talking about. So a few years ago, working with Sam and Alexa, and then also Prof. Yvonne McDermott-Rees in Swansea, we started to look at at what open source meant as an investigative methodology. You know, this was this new technique that was really being adopted widely. You know, you saw huge kind of landmark successes, and it was being sold at the time, particularly as kind of the future of human rights investigations, you know, for a lot of the reasons that Sam just mentioned, you know, that this was the future. And we wanted to know, well, what does that mean for human rights investigations? What does it look like as a methodology? What are the drawbacks? And our motivation was very much to see how we could best take advantage of open source. So not to think that it was the answer to all the world's evils, but to understand what were the benefits, but also what were the drawbacks. So how could we use it more effectively to contribute to more effective human rights investigations? So for the last couple of years, we've spent a lot of time interviewing different investigators, primarily from UN investigative bodies, you know, the different UN mechanisms, the commissions of inquiries, group of eminent experts, and also from NGOs such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. The types of people we've interviewed primarily work on large-scale investigations, so investigations, you know, into events in Syria, in Yemen, in Myanmar. But I think the findings are much more broadly relevant both to investigative journalism, you know, in terms of using open source to identify, to get to grips with an issue, to identify problems, but also to more specific, you know, incident-specific human rights investigations. So hopefully what I'll say is relatively relevant to all of them. I want to kind of talk about, I guess, three of the myths associated with open source. Not myths is the wrong word, but three things associated with open source, and then kind of unpack them and see, well, what lies beneath the surface of them. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the concept that open source will allow access to areas where investigators could not go. So I want to really look at the idea of open source and access, or how it leads an investigation. The second thing then I'd like to look at is the idea that open source will raise voices that are otherwise marginalized. So I want to see what that means in practice, and whether there are drawbacks to it. And the third then is that open source will revolutionize advocacy. I think we've all seen, well, Sam mentioned some of the different organizations, but we've seen how effective open source can be in terms of conducting advocacy, how easy it is to bring people along with the story when you can use open source methods. But I want to look a little bit further into that. So the first kind of myth is the wrong word, but unfortunately I'm tired and I can't think of another one. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the idea of access. And the common perception very much is that open source tools will allow you to go places where you can't go physically. So it will give you access to regimes or to areas that are cut off either because of the regime or because of conflict, environmental catastrophes, landslides, whatever it might be. And I think one of the really first modern uses of open source really gives proofs to that. North Korea is obviously a very closed country, but one of Sam's colleagues in a previous life took advantage of the first open source satellite imagery that came out in the early 2000s, and with that they were able to show the existence of prisoner camps, detention facilities. They could trace out where forced labourers were being used. They could see that the mines they were working in, they could see how farms were being developed with labour from these camps, and they could even see the guillotines and the execution centres in the middle of the camp. So really it allowed, to revolutionise it. It proved something that was a myth or a rumour. I think since then the situation has slightly changed, and we found that open source is perhaps slightly less useful in terms of getting access to closed-off places, because you often do have some form of access. So while an organisation like Amnesty or a UN Commission of Inquiry may not have access themselves, there are typically people working on the ground, both as individuals and organisations, who are there, who have local expertise and who can engage with it. And ironically enough, North Korea is probably the perfect example of somewhere at the moment where open source is relatively useless, because no one has smartphones. And so they're finding that with the current UN investigations into North Korea, what's really useful is witness testimony. It's people who have escaped, who have crossed the border, and it's their stories that are really driving the investigations on. But instead of allowing access, then what we started to look at was, well, how does open source guide access? How does it lead your investigation? And we found a couple of different things. The first is that certain violations are much more amenable to open source documentation than others. And that's just because of the nature of the investigation. What we found, and what a lot of investigators told us, is that things like airstrikes or artillery strikes or the use of force at protests, they're the types of violations that get documented using open source methods, because they're very dramatic. Visually, an airstrike and the explosions, or a crater, or tear gas or ammunition being fired into a crowd is very dramatic. And so that's where a lot of the open source investigations are being driven. But of course the flip side of that is that means that other violations are not being investigated to the same extent. They're invisible on open source, and so the risk is that less attention is paid to them. And things that would be very common there are issues of sexual or gender-based violence, things like ill treatment or torture in detention, where you physically don't have access, or people typically, not always, but typically aren't filming it. And also things like economic, social and cultural rights, impacts on access to education or access to food or access to healthcare, and things that aren't really amenable in the same way to open source investigation might be downplayed. The second element is that the fact that open source information is available may influence what is perceived as important by different actors. This was something that, if I was smarter, it probably wouldn't be a surprise, but it was really a huge surprise to me. And there's two elements to it. The first is that if an image or a video or an incident is being shared widely on social media, people reported that that's then what became important. So the fact that a particular airstrike or a particular attack became very prominent on social media and was widely shared meant that a lot of people who were affected by violations within a situation saw that incident as the most important thing, because that's what had the publicity. It had the international attention, there was videos of it, and so investigators reported then that people who had witnessed other violations or who had been victims of other violations kind of downplayed those other experiences and focused more on things that had become prominent because of the fact that they were on open source, where they were on open source because they'd hit that kind of goal of publicity, not because of the nature of the violations or whether they were reflective of the actual situation. The second element is that the fact that open source information was circulating often affected people's memories or recollections of an event. So typically when a video or a photograph is circulating, it will be a partial recording of an incident. You know, if it's a use of force, for example, at a protest, it'll be different snapshots of the force as opposed to, of course, a huge, full 360-degree view of it. And what we found was that because people were focusing on these videos, that it was affecting their own narrative. That discussion was being held around these events, people were talking about it, and then it was affecting how they remembered it. In traditional investigations, and I don't like the phrase, but I haven't come across a different one, people call it the village narrative. Essentially that when a village or a group or a community go through an experience together, they talk about it, which is entirely normal. And over the process of talking about it, individual specific memories, recollections, events become amalgamated into one. So you lose often all those different kind of perspectives, and we found that might be a risk because of the sharing of content on open source. The second element to talk about then is the idea that open source will raise voices that were marginalized in traditional investigations. It's definitely possible, and I think it's kind of self-evident that it does. That's the democratizing nature of technology. But of course, people don't often have access to it, and I think that's something that becomes very apparent in different contexts. So in some contexts, people just don't have access to smartphones. There's no 3G network, so you can't upload or 5G, I guess. There's no, you can't upload a document. But also, in other contexts, access to that technology is mediated. So, for example, it might be the male in a family who has access to the smartphone, and the wife or the kids get access through the male. So it's not a direct contact. And that means, of course, it means a couple of different things. First of all, it means that those groups who don't have direct access to the technologies can't tell their stories. They can't document their own experiences. They're depending on someone else documenting them for them. And the second is that it really affects the ability of open source information to reveal those other types of experiences. The best example I found of this was the gender-related effects of violence. And so over the last couple of years, the protests along the Gaza border have been very visible, and there's been some incredible kind of investigative journalism with the New York Times and Forensic Architecture has looked at it. And it's all focused on the attacks. It's focused on the shots that are fired. It's focused on people losing limbs or kites going, the fire kites going across into Israel. And what it's missed then is the gendered impact of those things. So the impact on a family of a husband dying or a husband becoming disabled. And one of the biggest issues that came out of there were things like domestic abuse. When the breadwinner is unable to work, what the impact is on the family, and all those kind of gender consequences of the initial violation that are just being mixed because the attractive is the wrong word, but the dramatic element to focus on is that initial attack. Now, of course, technology can get access to those voices in some ways that were previously impossible. So in the Gaza example, people FaceTimed or Skyped with women directly in their homes, and so we're able to get those stories and to hear them. But of course, that's dependent on independent access to technology. The last thing that I'll talk about very quickly is the impact on advocacy. Essentially, and this is what really attracts me to open source. When I used to work for NGOs and we were doing investigations, I always hated how we presented the findings, and some NGOs are still guilty. Essentially, we would say, look, this happened and it was a war crime. And I never understood why we couldn't say why. why we couldn't bring people through it and show them and let them reach their own conclusion. And I think that's the real power of open source, is you can talk someone through, the illegal use of force at a protest. You can give them videos of the crowd beforehand. You can explain the circumstances in which lethal force will be used, and you can show how the events involve and really allow people to come along with you and really understand your conclusion. Not, I'm a lawyer, trust me, but bring them to the conclusion. It's incredibly powerful, I think. The flip side of that is that, well, there's two elements, I guess. The first is that investigators are reporting that advocacy targets of politicians, senior UN figures, whoever, the State Department, Parliament, were expecting that type of material. So they were prioritizing then advocacy or information of violations that was presented in this open source way, and then downplaying or distrusting other sources of information, which is unfortunate because for other types of violations, as we just mentioned, there may not be open source. It doesn't mean that it didn't have a really rigorous interview with victims, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but they're wondering why isn't there this attractive element. And very much related to that was the idea then that because of that, investigators were reporting that they were in turn pressured to focus on those types of violations for their initial investigations. So you have a kind of vicious circle whereby particular types of advocacy are being prioritized because they're effective, means other violations are being downplayed, and then you're encouraged to pursue the effective investigations, and so you really, the potential is there to miss out on a huge array of violations and not to effectively document things that were the bread and butter of human rights work for a really long time. Those are things, the three kind of issues I wanted to address, but to emphasize, they're very much not intended to downplay the effectiveness of open source. I spend far too much of my time with it. I think it's an incredible technique, but it's really to help us start thinking about, if we're going to use it, how can we use it most effectively? How can we help this as a methodology to evolve and to become I can't think of the word. How can we let it evolve? Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Many questions. I won't ask them though right now. Maybe we'll talk about them.
Thanks.
Talk about them when we have when everyone's had a chance to speak. Really interesting. Thank you. Go ahead.
So really quickly, just because most of you probably don't know UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center and its investigations lab. What the Human Rights Center is a multidisciplinary center that was set up in the heart of UC Berkeley to bring together people who were doing research and coming up with new forms of technology that could help in the human rights space, who may not ordinarily have chances to work together, but to collaborate, recognizing that when a human being goes through an atrocity, their needs in the aftermath are not just related to law or to public health or to something technological, but that all of that ultimately is going to be probably part of helping to figure out next steps. So our investigations lab, we were starting at the Human Rights Center around the same time that Sam was beginning to think of creating the Digital Verification Corps. And what was nice about that parallel construction is that while we became part of the Digital Verification Corps, we also had a couple of other partners that we were beginning to work with. And one of the perspectives that we've taken is trying to think through the utility of some of these methodologies for a whole host of different disciplines that are working in the space with some nexus to social justice and human rights. Our investigations lab was set up to ultimately work with 3 different sets of partners. So there's the incredible human rights advocacy organizations like Amnesty International, who remains our biggest and most important partner and an incredible trainer for our students, to other groups like Physicians for Human Rights, etc. A second bucket of investigative reporters who maybe don't have the capacity, the language skills, the technological know-how, or just the time to do the really painstaking work of finding these places in digital online spaces and verifying that content so you know how reliable it is. The third bucket are human rights lawyers, and trying to think through in what ways can open source information ultimately support the evidentiary foundations of particularly international criminal cases. And the way we had come about creating this in the first place and our interest in the space was we had been doing some work with the International Criminal Court, and one of the things that we've been observing in our collaboration with the Office of the Prosecutor was that many cases were, as many of you know, after the court's first decade in practice, falling apart at fairly early stages of prosecution. And these were, of course, very high-profile cases because the court's mandate is to prosecute the most grave crimes around the world at the very highest levels of responsibility. And so one of the things we did was we sent a PhD student who was a historian to the court, and she went through thousands of pages of court records, and she came back with something that's broadly known today and is known by several people at the court as well, which was saying that what the judges are saying is that the prosecution team is potentially over-relying on witness testimony without bringing in corroborating information to help shore up what these survivors are saying happened in their communities. To keep a long story short, or relatively short, we began looking at, okay, so what are the other sources of information out there that could potentially come in and lend weight to what these survivors are saying? And so we began hosting a series of workshops to bring together people who were finding creative ways to tap into new digital technologies to find information about the world. And this was people who were using satellite imagery for remote analysis, people who were using big data analytics to try and get some statistical probabilities and senses of troop movements, where they were likely to go. But it was also groups like Witness and Eyewitness to Atrocity, who were trying to figure out how do you train people in conflict zones to capture the kinds of information that's helpful to courts. And I remember a big kind of duke it out. We had some big human rights organizations in the room in the court, and the big human rights organizations are like, you guys, the prosecutors, you can just get on the ground and get this information yourselves. You don't need it from us. Because the prosecutors were saying, why don't you give us your sources and your information? And the long story short there was that the Office of the Prosecutor had a relatively low budget. I think we had a colleague who once analogized, did the math, and found that it was about equivalent for the Office of the Prosecutor at the ICC as it was for the police in the city of Berkeley, California, which is relatively small. And when you can figure their mandate is theoretically at least the globe, that is a drop in the bucket. So we were trying to figure out how do we make the information coming out of these places, given the proliferation of the smartphone and how many people were trying to grab helpful content and get it out, and also given the rise of social media and how much was getting posted there, how do you begin to harness it so it's as helpful as possible for court purposes? Part of it was educating people that what they were getting a lot of was the body on the ground. Well, they often knew a crime had taken place. That's why they're investigating in the first place or want to investigate, as opposed to getting the 360 degrees. Or figuring out who was actually at the scene of that crime, because these are potentially witnesses who can corroborate the stories that other people are telling. Ultimately, one of the things we also began doing was talking to the social media companies themselves, trying to figure out how do we bring in this wealth of information, given the extraordinary volume and the potential richness of it. The most recent stats that are available online is that there's 6,000 tweets now going out every second and 500 hours of video being uploaded to YouTube every minute. So for investigators who have a huge mandate but limited bandwidth, how do you source all of that to find a needle in the haystack? We have a colleague who once called it trying to find a needle in a haystack made out of needles. So one of the things the company said is we can't give you, for legal accountability purposes, this information, but what you can do is about 95%, and I think this is a made-up statistic, but most of what you're saying you need, you can actually get yourselves if you figure out how to effectively clone these sources. And so we began looking around to see who's doing that well. And investigative reporters, and particularly some of the people that were at Storyful and other places that were beginning to look at the use of social media for reporting, had some really great technologies and some really great methodologies that we began to try and bring in. Since then, there have been a few breakthroughs in international criminal justice. One is the Almaty case, which dealt with the destruction of cultural heritage property. A lot of open source information was combined with closed source information to help show the extent of the harm that had been perpetrated and who did it. A lot of us were waiting to see how that report that came together would ultimately be received by the judges. And while it was great for the court that there was a guilty plea in that case, it was sad for those of us who wanted to see how this information was tested. However, a second breakthrough came through in August of 2017 with the Alwer Folly case, which dealt with the extrajudicial killing allegedly perpetrated by a man named Alwer Folly from Libya. And what was really kind of eye-opening in that particular case is that a lot of the information that underlay the warrant of arrest that was ultimately issued for him came from Facebook and from social media sites. And I think when we started doing this work back in the early 2010s, what we had always been told is, okay, this could be interesting, corroborating information. It may get you to witnesses because you can see who was actually at the scene, but you're never going to have it actually be a foundational piece of content for a case. And I remember feeling stupid and going, well, why is that? And it's kind of interesting to see how this is borne out, that as we've been able to source more information from online places, to see that the utility has broadened. So a few ways it's being used now in international criminal justice is certainly for the context around known atrocities. Preliminary examination, so before you get into the field and can fully investigate, knowing who you'd even want to talk to and where you'd even want to go in the first place to make your work more efficient and effective given limited budgets. Lead information that gets you to the witnesses that you want to interview. Linkage information is sort of a holy grail that you want to get, and it can be difficult with open sources, but knowing who was at the scene of the crime and being able to link the on-the-ground perpetrators to the highest level commanders who you're ultimately going after. And then, of course, for the base evidence itself. Some next steps in international criminal law and justice. My colleague Lindsay Freeman, who's here and a senior legal researcher with our senior legal, blanket on your, this is the jet lag kicking in. Senior legal researcher with our team is helping to lead all of these projects. But one is we recognize that there was a lack of standards globally for how to do this work and how to do it well. And I think one of the challenges, both at the national level and internationally, is how do we prepare a next generation or this generation of judges and juries and other fact finders to know how to evaluate the amount of content and the kinds of content that are coming into the courtroom. And so one of the things we've been doing with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is to try and gather information to establish a baseline set of standards for how this information can strengthen legal prosecution and other fact-finding related efforts.
Alexa, may I stop you just for a second? Because I'm going to just allow Chris is
to say a few words before,
and then I'll return back to you. Sorry, shuffling the, we're running a bit late.
Of course.
Sorry, I'll come back to you. Apologies.
No, that's fine.
Sorry, I will have to be quick, I'm afraid. Let me take you back to 1986 and Chile. Augusto Pinochet was the military dictator in Chile still. It was the last of the really bad years under his dictatorship. And two young American, Chileans who were resident in America were taking part in a demonstration in Santiago de Chile. A guy called Rodrigo Rojas and a woman called Carmen Quintana. The police poured petrol over the two of them and set fire to them. Carmen suffered multiple burns, and Rodrigo, because no hospital would look after him, decided he died 4 days later. I went to Rodrigo's funeral in 1986. Bizarrely, I was in Latin America training to be a priest in the Church of England and spent some of my time working for a human rights organisation in Argentina, and then for another one I was meant to be there for several months in Chile, but because I went to the funeral, Rodrigo's funeral, I was asked to leave the country within 24 hours, which I felt was probably a good idea. But interestingly, the Catholic priests at that time, the Vicaria de la Solidaridad in Chile had been really, really supportive of the human rights campaign. I mean, the Catholic Church had been exemplary in Chile, unlike Argentina, incidentally, where the present Pope was then a bishop, but for which I think he feels much guilt. But and Catholic priests had video cameras, and they filmed what happened to Rodrigo, and all of us who were involved were given copies of it, put inside tapes of Fantasia. It said Fantasia. So when I arrived at the airport, I was escorted to the airplane by the police and the army or whatever, and I thought they were going to take my luggage off me, but they actually put it in my lap, and then I had to hand over my copy of Fantasia to a nun in an airport in Colombia, and somehow or other that got onto American news networks, which I guess is the sort of version of what we're talking about way back in 1986. My anxiety always about the British, and I think the Americans have caught this a bit too, is we have a very kind of nostalgic, romantic understanding of truth. You've got your truth, I've got my truth. Beauty is truth, beauty, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know, as Keats wrote. or for that matter, Donald Trump's version, which is you've got facts, I've got some alternative facts. I worry that has infected a lot of the political world, which is why, though I was a Remainer, I remain a Remainer, and I will remain a Remainer until my dying day, I do believe in scepticism. I think the proper scepticism of somebody who is presented with a so-called fact and looks at it and checks it is a really, really important part of what journalism, for that matter, what politicians should do. Quite often when somebody comes into my constituency surgery, they will have somewhat exaggerated their case so as to get me interested. And actually I'm interested in the non-exaggerated version. But one of the first things you have to learn as a politician is to sort of take away the dross and get back to the original hard nugget of the facts. And that's a difficult thing to do in this modern era. I was really struck by this most recently, and this is a challenge for everything that's been said earlier, I think, in relation to the demonstrations and the, it depends what you want to call it, the plebiscite, the referendum, the illegal referendum in Catalonia. Because I remember seeing Marta Torres Sila boldly saying on television and holding up her hands and saying every single one of her fingers had been broken one by the police and she had been raped. 3 days later she said, well, actually I was exaggerating a bit. It was, in fact, none of my fingers had been broken. But that was the bit that dominated all the news in the UK. Every single newspaper ran the first half of the story. Only one ran the second half of the story, that she was retracting what she'd said. And so that, incidentally, is the bell ringing quite quietly. But because there was an image, a photographic image, and a woman speaking, very passionately, somehow, that was the only line that it was acceptable to say. And I remember arguing about this with members of the SNP in the Chamber of the Commons, because I was saying, well, I'm not quite sure it is quite as you portray it. I think you don't quite understand the law in Spain and the nature of the constitution and what it took to get from Franco to modern, democratic Spain. And actually, half the things that the Catalan separatists were putting up on Twitter and on Facebook, claiming that these were new incidents, were actually fascist demonstrations from 20 years and 5 years previously. So this is the other aspect, of course. You have to bear in mind that a lot of people who are putting things up on social media are putting them up for a reason, because that's their truth, not necessarily the truth. I hope, I've just been writing about a period of British history, the 1930s, and in particular about a man called Victor Cazalet, who was very close to General Sikorski, who was the leader of the Free Poles. One of Sikorski's most difficult battles was with the Russians, who had murdered virtually all the Polish officer class in the Katyn massacre, which was authorised by Lavrenti Beria. Churchill refused to believe Sikorski because it was not convenient not to have the Russians on board to fight the Nazis. And it's only, I think, in 1993 or something like that that Russia owned up to what actually happened, even though it was absolutely clear and evident. One would like to think that such a thing could not happen again today, because there would be too many people with mobile phones and so on. But I wonder. And on that note, I'll go and vote.
Thank you. Sorry you were
I will exercise my democratic principles and doubtless
much.
bring down the government in one fell swoop.
Thank you very much.
And I'm sorry to go. Everything has been fascinating. Sorry.
Thanks very much.
So I'd love to pick up on
Yeah,
that.
there's a number of things
piece.
there.
There's so much there on so many levels. I think this idea, so when we work with these three different buckets of reporters, legal investigators, and human rights advocacy organizations, what they all have in common is that their currency is facts. And right now, I think facts are very much under attack, at least in the United States, where I live. And one of the challenges in the human rights space is to rebuild a certain faith in facts. So one of the things that I think we're really struggling with in our own investigations lab is the nature of bias both the bias in what makes it up online and the bias with which we perceive it. So there's a study when I used to teach psychology of law that I found really illuminating. And what they did is they wanted to know if cops were overly pressuring people in interrogation rooms. So they decided that they would do a role play where they had two actors, one being the cop, one being the person interrogated, and they would shoot the scene with the camera behind the shoulder of the cop facing the person being interrogated. In the next round, they would shoot it from behind the person being interrogated back at the cop. And at the third, they would place the camera above everyone in a neutral position. And then they would have hundreds of people evaluate, was the cop overly prejudicial and abusive? Was the person being interrogated being swirly or unresponsive? What was happening in these rooms? And what they found is that the people who studied these scenes from these three different perspectives had radically different impressions of what had taken place in that courtroom with the exact same lines and the exact same underlying facts. So the angles of perception, I think, are something that we do need to be paying attention to, and the fact that a video captures such a small piece of reality. And I think that's where, in legal practice, this need to triangulate your testimonial evidence, so what people say, with the physical evidence of what happened, with the documentary information, the contracts, the written orders, and increasingly also, some people place digital content in another bucket, some people place it there, but bringing that together. The other thing I'll say is that I'm doing a big so in addition to being a lawyer, my other hat is as a social scientist, and I'm doing a study with a colleague named Ulrich Egan right now, looking at this issue of sexual violence and open source information. And what we were hearing anecdotally in the space is everyone was assuming, yeah, sexual violence crimes are just not amenable to open source information. And we decided to probe that assumption. I was one of the people who've been saying that. And now we've interviewed quite a few war crimes investigators from all over the world. And what we're finding is that they're all initially saying, yeah, we're really worried sexual violence cases will be diluted because we're going to be putting our attention toward the shiny object. And what we're finding is that while to some extent that's true, we're also finding there's a lot more content, and a lot of those investigators about halfway through the interview when we're pushing them are going, you know what, actually there's a lot of information online now that I think about it. And so we've been trying to look at why this information is being missed, and there's a few reasons. One is the language of the people doing the investigating in the first place. There's a story I was told about some Shield women in Guatemala who had been raped by Rios Montt and the men working for him. And they ended up going onto Twitter and posting in the Shield during the Rios Montt trial about their rapes. But a lot of the English-speaking investigators were not picking up on that information because they didn't speak that relatively rare, globally speaking language. The second one is the terminology. When you're talking about stigmatized crimes, women don't just say, hey, I was raped. There's a lot of coded language that goes around with sexual violence, and a lot of us as investigators are not trained in what those codes are. We talked a little bit about it in terms of investigating neo-Nazis. So one of the things that you're taught in investigating neo-Nazis is to look for the code 1488, because someone's not going to go on Twitter and say, hey, I'm a neo-Nazi. They might signal to each other by putting that series of numbers, with 14 standing for a famous speech by Hitler, as I understand it, and 88 standing for HH, for Heil Hitler, as the 8th letter of the alphabet. It's the same thing with sexual violence, but a lot of people aren't paying attention to those codes. So for example, with sex trafficking, it may be one day to get a key is talking about getting a woman and putting her on the open market. The next day it might be called getting coffee. And I think it's really incumbent upon us as investigators to really deeply understand not only the technologies of the people who are most impacted and what they're using to communicate, because they are communicating, we just might not be seeing it, but to know what we're seeing when it's right in front of our face. So to have a wife might mean something very different in different kinds of cultures. And I think that many of the women, particularly the female investigators, when we were at the end of the investigations, were really angry, and there was a lot of expletives by the end of it, calling it like the New York expletive times, etc. Everything for the tropes that they were seeing reporters put up that were of the woman in a veil huddling in the corner with the child born of rape behind her, while the men who were being released from the detention centers were being paraded naked through the streets, and talking about the stereotypes and how this reinforces what's called to our attention and what we actually pay attention to. The final thing I would say is our team right now is 70 students who speak 28 languages and come from 33 different disciplines. I think ultimately the nature of this work has to become more collaborative across disciplines. You have computer scientists working alongside lawyers, working alongside reporters and other investigators. It needs to become more multilingual. I think we're finding a lot of information that some of our partners aren't just because we have one or two people. We're working with a team right now, it's an international group. They're investigating crimes in Syria and they have no Arabic speakers on their team. We have 5 at Berkeley. So I think that capacity is really, really critical. The third is how to teach skepticism and how to teach healthy skepticism without gutting people's sense of facts. And so some of the things that we've been playing with at least is first making sure that everyone has drilled into their head that we always work with multiple working hypotheses. We don't come and investigate these issues from one perspective of what may have happened, but we try and what we also sometimes call prove the null hypothesis. If I think X did Y to Z, can I prove that X did not do Y to Z, if that's what I'm going after? We also started partnering every teammate with another teammate because we found that that would be a great check on biases. We had one young woman who was doing a geolocation, so using satellite imagery to place a video in a particular conflict, and she was sure she had found the exact location, the patterns of roads and everything lined up beautifully. And then her teammate came along and said, "Are you sure? Because I found this other place over here that looks very similar." And I think that peer review, whether it's at the individual level or the organizational one, is quite important. And then the third is just making sure that more training happens. We've tried to launch recently with the Institute for International Criminal Investigations, a training for war crimes investigators to get more facility in these. But if we keep these skill sets to reporters, I think that in terms of what this does to democracy and our collective understanding of facts, ultimately becomes very degraded.
Yeah, totally. Great, thank you. It's really interesting, your emphasis on collaboration. If you take the example that you were talking about with sexual violence and needing a language and needing an understanding to be able to investigate correctly, are things people are finding out in the course of doing this, are they actually being shared so that it isn't like everybody is opening, the page for the first time? Is there a network of people who are doing these investigations that are sharing their findings and their...
So yes and no. I think it's all along a spectrum. If you look at a collective like Bellingcat, they're sharing information and they're sharing it very openly on platforms like Twitter. I think some of us get a little uncomfortable sometimes at how much information is being shared so publicly because of the risks that can also raise. But I do think that there is an increasing network of people who are trying to strengthen each other and share information. I know several of us are working on incidents related to Chile or Cameroon or whatever, and these partnerships are incredibly powerful and impactful. And I think really important to nurture and foster. It takes a lot of trust, and it takes an ability to talk across fields of practice, which can also be really challenging. That requires a certain degree of humility that we don't always find in very lauded professions. And so I think that when you're talking about reporters working alongside lawyers, it's sometimes finding the right lawyer working alongside the right reporters so that you can learn from each other and push out of your comfort zone a little bit. We have talked about it in ethics. I think one of the things Sam and Dara and we've been trying to help lead on is bringing an ethical framework to this work also, because you can really operate from a ends justifies the means perspective in this work. And you see a lot of people who are racing to the finish line to break open big stories. But there are a lot of issues that arise from that. I think just looking at sexual violence is such a canary in the coal mine for this set of methodologies. Sure. Because you look at issues like privacy and consent. I had 2 young investigators who were working on a sexual violence investigation, and they said, we just started to get we didn't know what to do with this information. We were hearing about women's and men's most horrific moments, and their consent had already been taken away from them. And then these things have been posted online without their consent. And we're helping an NGO put out a big public report about this set of mass rape. Sure. These people haven't consented to that either. And I think there's a lot that needs to come in to almost slow things down a little bit and start thinking through what does ethical practice look like. We've talked about maybe having a crowdsourcing of the ethical dilemmas we're all facing in this sort of new terrain and area of practice to help each other think through what does ethics look like.
Very good idea. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. So, questions, comments? We've got about 20 minutes left. I'll let you think about it a little bit, and I'll ask one first, maybe. I was interested in, Dara, what you said, basically about how the shiny object, I think you used that expression, is so attractive, forgetting slightly the sort of deeper work, the contextual work. You said it better than I am, but and whether or not that you're actually actively thinking about how to join things up. And it reminded me actually of, what journalists are accused of a lot. They run in for a story and then they pull out, when it gets boring or it isn't front page or whatever, if you see what I mean, anymore. And it's got that kind of feel to it because there's something out there that is very attractive and big, and you can prove it easily, you can get a lot of people involved, you can make a splash, but actually there's so much more there. And so is there a discussion about that? Maybe. In Amnesty, presumably, there would be all the time, I would have thought.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that Darryl, it's a difficult thing, the advocacy side. I think if I look at a conflict or an ongoing situation such as Cameroon, the violence in Cameroon, which is of a horrific level that nobody ever talks about, or the protests in Iraq, over 300 people killed since the 1st of October. Who knows that? Nobody. Actually, the open source work has helped us get these conflicts and get these issues on the table by chasing, if you like, after the shiny object, putting the shiny object in front of the journalist. Look the wrong way. Say, look, and look at all this as well.
That's the point in front.
Yeah, exactly. And look at all this as well, and it helps us to keep the momentum around these issues going. And I think that's where open source has been really helpful, and where it's allowed us as an organisation certainly to push forward on advocacy in arenas that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to push forward on. And I think, for example, when we did our work on the smoke grenades being used in Iraq, probably only 26 people were killed by this means in Iraq, from what we could work out, as opposed to the 400 or so killed by, gunfire, bullets, normal ways of mastering populations. But being able to actually put that in front of the British mission to the United Nations in Geneva on the day of the Universal Periodic Review of Iraq got the protests and the violence in Iraq onto the UPR, which I actually don't think it otherwise would have. So it allows us to put these kind of stories, if you like, on the radar that otherwise we wouldn't.
I think it's a really good question, which is why I was frowning a lot. I think it's massively complex, though, and I think it kind of ties together everything that we've all been talking about. I think what we're trying to figure out is how can open source techniques be most effectively incorporated into traditional investigations. So how can we move investigations away from sole reliance on the pen and the recorder to also incorporate open source techniques effectively? And that's partially about skills, so that people know what to expect. Often we work with partners and they say, great, open source, do this, and you're like, Jesus, that's impossible. So it's about knowing what's possible and what's not, the resources, the time to do it. And I think what you're talking about in terms of shiny objects are different elements. For me, and the reason I like working with the lads so much, is that we try and be very collaborative and to share and not competitive. And I think that that's something essential in this throughout the entire process. So for example, if you have our universities or Amnesty working on a project, we will inevitably focus on some very small elements, while a huge amount goes on in Cameroon or whatever it is. And there, I think it's really important to understand at the outset that none of us knows what advocacy will work. I think that's the truth, and so I think we have to take a multifaceted approach. Some of it is long term, some of it is the shiny object, some of it is, a protest on the street or, climbing down a chimney to stop it working. Like, there's multiple different advocacy perspectives. And so in doing these types of investigations, it's really important to develop relationships and skills with people who are working there and who can then use that to inform the bigger picture and to develop the knowledge that will go up. And I think that's really a key. And I think it's something that we would all of us would be into, but I don't know that it's necessarily happening entirely. I had interviewed a couple of different people, I won't say where, but one monolithic, very, very famous newspaper with an excellent investigative team who did phenomenal reporting in a context, and it was like, it blew me away. I thought it was some of the best reporting I'd seen, and I thought, Jesus, from a human rights advocacy and litigation perspective, this is huge. But then I also interviewed a lot of the people who worked as lawyers and a civil society organisations representing the people in those videos who were interviewed, and they had a really bad experience of people kind of parachuting in from a major Western capital, or two major Western capitals, and coming in and raising victims' expectations, taking over, disrupting processes, putting advocacy material out that might harm their domestic case. So I think there's a much, that element, it's a huge issue. So I think we have the potential to be very effective and collaborative, and to allow what we do to complement what other people do and vice versa, but it's something to be very acutely aware of. And because, sorry, this is my I'm waffling, this is the last point, but the people who have the expertise now are primarily in the West, and the resources to do it. And so I think like the kind of imperial jump in, save the day issue is something to be very conscious of.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, maybe on the collaborative piece. I think one of the things that I've been trying to push with funders for this is how much you really need to support an entire ecosystem. I think you have lawyers who are using some of these methodologies, you have reporters, advocacy groups, etc. But we really need everyone in that to be a healthy and communicative partner in this effort towards justice. I think when you've got the groups like Witness and Eyewitness on the ground training people how to capture images that will be effective for later advocacy and accountability purposes, that information then feeds into these open sources where other players in the system can get access to it, and then put out the reports and campaign with governments and put the pressure on to build the political will. Because a lot of times these cases aren't going to happen until there's the political will to actually put the time and the money into making those keystone cases occur. And so I think we sometimes fail when we're working in isolation to really appreciate the ways that reporters and advocacy groups make the later stage cases possible. And what we need is more communication all along that chain of from the lawyers telling the people doing the trainings on the ground, here's what we need to build better cases. And then advocacy groups making sure that they're not interviewing the same people who might be really valuable witnesses over and over and destroying them for evidentiary purposes. If what that survivor wants is to someday testify in court, and if the advocacy piece is secondary to that interest. So again, I think it gets back to what Dara was saying about raising the expectations.
Yeah, very much so. Please go ahead.
I'm involved with the assistance with the Iranian resistance in Iran. And probably aware, in November, 1,500 were killed, and Amnesty produced reports on it. But the Revolutionary Guard would not even release the names of the people who were killed. They had to be found out one by people missing. And since then, there's been a lot of torture, a lot of arrests, a lot of disappearances. And indeed, right up to last week, almost every day, one county or another in Iran has been involved in violence. But we can't verify the film. Deluge is out, film comes out, social media comes out. The difficulty is confirming it. I wondered if maybe Amnesty or one of your other projects has actually got a way of double checking, because media will only use this if it's authenticated. We know it's true. We know some of the people in it. Some of the people in it are dead now. But that's not good enough for third-party consumption, for media consumption. So I wondered what your experience was in this area.
Sure. I mean,
No, go ahead.
we did lots of work on this. So, all through the protests, we were getting videos. Iran team were doing very amazing work. And it was very hard for them. They were being attacked also on social media themselves by people from within the country or supporting the regime. But they were getting videos out through a variety of means. One of the challenges we had, though, and Chris Bryant referred to this, is a lot of the videos were in the same place, in the same geography, but from the protests in 2017. So it was a matter of going through very carefully, and the term has emerged called chronolocation. I'm not sure I like it very much, but it's a term that's emerged, which is like you can check the features of a video, or you go through and check the features of a video, and work out how the topography or the geography or the features of that space have changed over time. To say, okay, this billboard wasn't there in 2017; it's now there in 2019 or 2020. And those processes are going through that, and then building trust with your sources. And that's actually a very important thing in this process, because if you build trust with people on the ground, you're kind of going away from open source if you do that to more kind of traditional research. Hey, can you send us these more videos of this or more videos of that? But when you start building that trust, you start getting more content, and then you can trust it more. But the important thing in this area, especially from an environment like Iran, is to work out that you know exactly where it was filmed, basically the exact street corner. And you can do that. Alexa referred to that through using satellite imagery to work out, okay, that street crossing is there, those trees, that park is there, etc., and to work out when it was filmed. And that can be making sure it's not appeared on the internet before. A lot of this content that does appear on the internet before. And even if it doesn't appear on the internet before, can you work out that the features have changed in some way? So we did that repeatedly throughout the whole protest, and worked with some news organizations then to publish those videos as well. So it is being done, and happy to talk about how to support you going forward if that's something of interest.
Yeah, there's very good techniques now to verify video, in short. I mean, it's possible. I couldn't do it, but question there. Can you speak up, sorry, and introduce yourself, if you wouldn't mind?
I think there's a few different ways. One is, of course, just the education component. I think, at least in the United States, the media literacy piece really needs to be played up. And I actually think some of the younger generations are better at this than the older generations, at least where I live in California. And sometimes knowing that, as was said earlier, there are often these agendas. Part of the verification process is not just working out the who, what, when, where, and why, or how, but it's also the knowing why someone shared it and checking the source, who they are, were they really there, do they have first-hand knowledge, are they reliable? There are some technological solutions that I think are also being raised. I have a couple students who are working on a project right now that every time you bring up a piece of content, if it's rated as coming from a more conservative or liberal publication, they'll bring up 3 other pieces of content that are coming from other publications that have been rated very differently. So you're seeing the same story automatically through those 4 lenses. And I think things like that, we know that rationality doesn't always change minds, that oftentimes it's a very emotional response that we have to what we see, and the ways that we psychologically process that is much more complex than we sometimes recognize. I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done, or bring in the neuroscience and the psychological research that's already been done into the communities of practice. And I think, again, that gets back to the multidisciplinarity that's really needed to do this work well. But just really fast.
Anybody else want to add to that?
I mean, yeah, let's take more questions.
Okay, we'll take
Maybe
a few.
afterwards.
We'll take a few now in a row, and then we'll take another few if we have time. The lady at the back there was waiting.
Yes, my name is Kathleen. I'm here today to go to my question is, Dan touched on it earlier with trauma and PTSD, and I was wondering, especially since you work with students, at the moment you're training them, what do you do to safeguard the mental health of your educators?
Thanks. And there's a question there now.
Yeah, so mine is kind of the opposite of what Tommy was saying about posting first and then thinking later. I have a background in working in the foreign service in Abu Dhabi, and there's a lot of censorship, and there's a lot of misinformation from all parts of society, all the way up to the top. And we had a big difficulty trying to sift through the information and find what was actually true. And I was wondering if there are any methods to do this in a good way and actually find what's true. There's not really confidence with anyone.
A third one. I saw more hands here.
Hi, Hannah from International. I was wondering if you could touch briefly on the book that you just published on digital.
Oh yeah, I meant to mention that.
And
Sorry.
how it goes towards
My
and
mistake.
maybe standards like you mentioned earlier.
How much
Thanks
were
for
you
that
paid?
question. Thanks for that question, because I really meant to mention the book at the beginning and I
You
completely
weren't paid
forgot,
enough,
so I apologize. These three, I'll tell you quickly because I feel so guilty, have co-edited a book on this subject, and it's being published this week, I believe, isn't it? By Oxford University Press.
It's available now.
It's
so-
available now. Okay. So thanks for that, and someone can talk about it. Indeed. Let's take the questions in order. Did you want to talk about the trauma?
Sure, I
perhaps
can do that quickly
start
and then
with
move
that?
it on.
Yeah.
I think it's an awesome question, and it's something we've really struggled with. I think we struggled with it in human rights, probably in journalism as well.
Yeah,
but for
very
a
much
long, long time, like I had a pretty horrendous experience with burnout and just not a lot of fun. And I think what we've done very much under Sam's leadership is to try and talk to students about it and to build resilience. And I think one of the biggest things that has made a difference is being very open and saying, and put us talking about our own experience, saying this is potentially a part of the job. You know, it's not something to be glorified or anything, but it's something that could happen, and we have to be very open about talking about it. So a lot of what we do is to go through different resilience techniques. You know, how to look after yourselves, how to look after other people, you know, the signs that you might have, and we do that from day one of our training with them and do it throughout. And I think that kind of conversation and paying attention to it has really helped us, because it's meant that when there have been issues, people have been very comfortable to come and talk to us about them, and then we can help them, or we can signpost them to other people who can help them. We can make sure that they take a break, that they feel comfortable with taking a break. So for me, I guess the bottom line is about openness and resilience.
Can I add one more thing to that? I think wearing the sociologist hat for a minute. I think one of the things we've tried to do is build off of Sam's incredible research, but think about it at the institutional level as needing to help prepare the students individually, and by that, greater awareness. Here's the tips and tricks for minimizing potential impact, and community, which we found is actually the most important part, is that people feel like they're part of a community. The second is cultural. I think so many of the groups that work with open source information or do investigations have a culture that's very much, you can toughen up or get out kind of thing. And I think we're finding that doesn't pan out. It's also a generational divide. I was speaking to a very high-level UN person the other day in human rights, and she was like, at least, Alexa, your students aren't going out into the battlefield and getting hurt. But what she was ignoring was a lot of the drone studies that have come out and similar studies that show that watching hours after hours of graphic footage and seeing your target up close is in some ways more likely to result in some kind of psychological harm than being on a battlefield and flying over it, dropping a bomb, and flying off. So I think there's a lack of appreciation for just how much vulnerability this can create. And the third is structural, making sure that there are structures in place that people know how to report, know how to talk about it, know how to get the support services that they need. And so I think it's only by bringing those three together, and we're constantly iterating on that, we can try and do a better job at it.
I'll just add, if I may, just very quickly to that. I mean, I think the interesting thing is the students we work with have probably had more mental health training than anybody I know at Amnesty International. I think it's never happened before, and we're all kind of a little bit fumbling in the dark how to do this for the best way, but I think the thing, I don't like patting myself on the back, but I think we should all pat ourselves on the back for here, is at least we're doing it, at least we're trying. We might not be getting it perfectly right, but we're giving the students a space to try it out also, work out if this is for them, and we're giving them hopefully tools and techniques that will be useful for their whole careers. I know loads of people at Amnesty Human Rights Watch have never had a jot of mental health support, and newsrooms for that matter.
Yeah.
So, I think it's important at least we're opening that door and we're talking about it.
Can you segue into the question about sifting through masses of information?
I can. It's overwhelming.
Yes, it is overwhelming.
I mean, I think it relates a lot to Tommy's question. Both questions go into each other.
Yeah,
and
they do.
because the point I was going to make about the question there is, we often talk about media literacy and like the importance of media literacy. And my mum's in the audience, so I'm just going to point her out. Because during the last election, I was like spending a lot of time correcting my mum's friends' Facebook posts on both sides of the political spectrum, right? And the problem with one of the challenges, I think media literacy is really important. I've given media literacy class training to my son's 8-year-old school class. is actually with a certain generation of people, if you start giving them media literacy training, it actually helps them confirm their beliefs. Because there's so much out there, they go and use these techniques and look things up, and you see, told you vaccines don't work, etc., etc. I've got all this proof now, and they actually use those techniques. So it's a really tough one, and having skepticism is really important. But media literacy and teaching people to go look for things is only part of the problem, and the rest is a whole kind of unraveling of the social media networks and working out what their responsibilities are. Twitter's trying something out new with labels, which terrifies me because somebody's going to find a way to game that and all this kind of stuff. So that goes back into your thing about, you know, sifting through this information. I mean, I think it's really hard. That's a great answer, isn't it? It's really hard.
Well, it is.
But it is. But it comes into Alexa's triangulation. I think it's the only way to do that is to, you know, you go through the social media posts, you go through anything you can find, you go through the data sets, you go and speak to people, and you see what all of that together brings you. Because if you're only using one platform, we had it in the protests in Hong Kong with our researchers on the ground. They'd be sending me videos and be like, "Oh, look, there's another violation by the Hong Kong police force," and you look at the video and be like, "No, it's not." And actually having that outside perspective is really useful, and to actually hold them in check, to check those biases as well. So it's kind of all of those things together, which is a really unsatisfactory answer, I think.
It's a huge question. I don't know if we're going to be able to help you today with it, but it's a great question, obviously central to this whole process of open data, so it's a good question.
Yeah.
And finally, one person should just tell the audience, please, about your book. Alexa,
Okay,
go on then.
on the legal, so I think what we're trying to do with the book is create a first primer, really, for people who are in this space and want to explore other areas of open source practice, like the ethics questions, like the psychosocial, or physical, or digital security issues that come up. But it also goes through the history of it. We also try to get at some of the legal accountability pieces. So Lindsay wrote a chapter looking at the use of open source information at the International Criminal Court. We have a chapter that pulls out principles from the International Protocol that will be available hopefully in late summer, early fall, setting kind of guidelines and minimum standards for doing this type of work going forward. Anything else I should mention for the book? But it's a great, I think the most exciting thing for me is it's a great collaboration. There's 15 contributors. They come from everywhere from Bellingcat to the New York Times to Amnesty International to academic organizations who are doing this. So it's really kind of insights from some of the leaders.
There's a community growing.
It really is.
So great, thank you, and look out for the book if you're interested. It's, as I say, it's Oxford University Press, and all their names. You can find it through all their names. Digital Witness, sorry, yes, I should say the title. So thanks everyone for coming out tonight, and please join me in thanking our amazing panel. I'd like to thank you, the Foreign Policy Center, as well, and Chris, who's not with us anymore. So thanks everyone for coming out.